members of the audience in Hay are about to take their seats, and we can kick off. So welcome to the second day of this conference and to a truly international panel with speakers joining us from Hawaii, Warsaw and Otago. We will have the usual pattern of 3 papers taken consecutively, and then there will be time around 25 to 30 minutes at the end for questions. Those of us who were with us, those of you who were with us yesterday will have noticed that it wasn't quite straightforward for the question and answer sessions online. So we're going to solve that little problem. The arrangements will be that those of us who are in the room who have questions will be invited to come up and to sit where I am sitting to pose their question. Those of you online will be able to put questions in the question and answer or to raise your hand. I've also been asked to point out that it is extremely wet this morning in Hay. And for this reason, again, evidence yesterday suggests that this might interfere with the bandwidth. So we would like to request that when you're not speaking, please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones so that we will minimize the potential disruption. Okay, so without further ado, we will move to our first speaker, who is Noriko Asato from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, if I have pronounced that correctly, Noriko. Yes. Her paper today is entitled Japanese Immigrant Bookstores in Territorial Hawaii, 1898 to 1941. If you would like to attempt to share screen now, Noriko, assuming that you have a presentation for us.
Okay. Yeah, I can't share somehow. Can you just let me share?
Okay. Let me see if I can live up to the name that I have been given for this morning by pretending to be as tech savvy as Eben. Right.
Yeah, I can do now, yes.
Try again now, that should work.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah, wonderful.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, aloha everyone. My name is Noriko Sato. Even give me a nice introduction. My presentation today is Japanese immigrant bookstores in territorial Hawaii, 1898 to 1941. So the history of immigrants from different countries to the United States has been told by historians and anthropologists and also immigrants themselves. They offer many different unique stories. So among those narratives, what's remarkable is how their native language was such a part of their identities and how it is affected, most negatively actually, their lives in the new world. So perhaps because of this, the world of immigrant reading and reading spheres, such as bookstores, have almost never been the center of their experiences. So there's also the common myth there isn't much to see. So this misunderstanding is deeply rooted in the fact that they often had a limited English proficiency, and American public institutions such as public libraries and the schools disregarded their readings. So so this silence is even more pronounced when it comes to Asia or Asian American print cultures. So as an effort to expand our understanding for Asian print cultures in the United States, this paper looks at the rise of the Japanese book trade in pre-war in Hawaii. So annexed by the US in 1898, Hawaii remained as an American territory until 1959. So Americans reshaped the territory, suppressing Hawaiian language and culture and recruiting thousands of foreign laborers to work on sugar plantations. The largest number of foreign workers were Japanese. So many of these first generation immigrants, or Issei, settled in Hawaii seeking economic opportunities. And as a part of this development, they established Japanese newspapers, bookstores, and traveling lending libraries. So between 1896 and 1941, there were 14 major bookstores and at least another 24 general stores or pharmacies selling Japanese books and magazines in Honolulu alone. So primarily, those were imported from Japan, along with the few local publishers. So by 1920, Hawaii's Japanese bookstores had grown so much that they are selling 20,000 books and magazines each month. So, however, history books on Japanese in America only occasionally offer sketchy description of bookstores or reading and hardly provide any substantive information. So in contrast, there are many books and business records on the book business and every aspect of print culture in Japan, such as the history of bookstores and publishers, membership directories of book business guilds, and government records from as far back as the late 19th century. So this helps produce excellent research in English in Japanese print culture, such as Kaneki or Kamei Daichi. So Japanese bookstores in Hawaii don't appear in the major references such as bookstore owners or union membership directories, typically utilized for Japanese publishing research. However, there are annual surveys conducted by the Japanese government on overseas Japanese occupations in various places, including Hawaii. So according to the surveys, the number of Japanese engaged in the book business in Hawaii was none between 1913 and 1917. But by 1918, there were 14 people, although the following year it decreased to 6. However, my research found 14 bookstores and 29 general stores selling books and magazines, making a total of 43 between 1896 and 1942. So this number still underestimates the whole picture, as many smaller stores which dealt with books didn't have enough business to make advertising profitable, because my research was basically looking at the bookstores advertisement. So these statistics also don't reflect the number of bookstores on the other islands of Hawaii either. So the earliest records of Japanese book distribution in Hawaii were a brief description of peddlers. Around 1892, Sanshichi Ozaki from Kanagawa Prefecture peddled in sugar plantations and sold an ezoshi, or printed picture books, for 20 to 30 cents, and a novel for 70 to 80 cents, along with the Japanese foods. So as soon as merchandise was sold out, he immediately ordered more from Japan, asking his brother to ship him goods. So Japanese immigrants were provided with basic living quarters called camp on the plantation premise. So for peddlers, Japanese camps must have been ideal business venues, since they are usually remote and isolated from the cities. So many peddlers were also engaged in the book rental business and competed over business territories. So their business took place wherever people gathered, such as barbers. These early bookstore advertisements indicate that some of these stores were not full-scale bookstores, but were either general stores or pharmacies. They also engaged in wholesale trade, disseminating print materials to smaller stores in Honolulu and the neighboring islands. So these bookstores gathered with other Japanese businesses, creating Japantown in Ara Park between Britannia and North King Street. So many of the large stores selling bookstores are pharmacies. Some of them developed a bookstore department. So Tanseido, for example, was founded in 1918 by Ichitaro Tomita and a fellow countryman with $10,000 in startup capital. Pharmacies in America sold much more than medicine and medical equipment, such as cosmetics, stationery, musical instruments, tobacco, and even soft drinks. So the appearance of these stores looks like, department stores. So generally, American stores close around 5 or 6 o'clock, but pharmacies are open throughout the night. So naturally, they attract various kinds of customers. In addition to local Japanese language newspapers, in the era before newsreels and radio broadcasts from Japan came to Hawaii, publications imported from Japan must have been one of the fewer sources for the Japanese immigrants to learn about the current studies of Japanese politics, cultural trends, technology, and what's new in Japan and also in the world. Another bookstore, Matsumura Bookstore, was started by Masaho Matsumura, who had arrived in Hawaii in 1906 from Hiroshima, Japan, when he was 24 years old. His advertisement included books, magazines, national textbooks, reference books, wall maps, some of the Japan's leading local newspapers, and the stationery goods. So the textbooks and maps must have been the most welcome at local Japanese language schools, which taught children who came to Hawaii with their immigrant parents, and also local-born Japanese American Nisei children. So in 1908, there are about 80 Japanese elementary schools and over 5,000 students attending afternoon schools. So run by either individuals or religious organizations. So importing Japanese national textbooks was a lucrative business prospect. So successful bookstores in Japan typically began their business by dealing with national textbooks to create foundation, and then gradually expanded their trade to general books and then magazines. So another example of Matsumura's business talent became evident when the bookstore sponsored a Dodoitsu, or Japanese light poem competition. He invited readers of the local Japanese newspaper, Nippu Jiji. Winners would receive gift certificate for books. The competition was very popular, so it allowed Issei to express their inner passion for reading and then how Japanese language books were integral to their practical and emotional existence. So Japanese books inspire the hidden cultural lives of Hawaii, ethnic Japanese community. So they also thoroughly discredit any disparaging of the literary aspiration of these book-hungry immigrants. So another prominent bookstore in Hawaii was the Motoshige bookstore. It was started as a pharmacy on North King Street in 1897 by Wasuke Motoshige, who had left Tokyo for Hawaii 3 years earlier. So he became very successful and later opened 2 branch stores. So these stores developed into a trading company, and Motoshige became one of the most prominent businessmen in early Japanese American community in Hawaii. By 1920 and 1915, its book department regularly published 4-page newspaper advertisements, listing over 400 titles at a time. So judging by that list, there might be at least 1,000 to 1,500 books on the shelves on any given day. So in this August 1912 advertisement, the most salient category to reflect their spiritual needs is shuyo books on self-improvement or morals. Many Issei immigrants packed 1 or 2 shuyo books in their bundle trunks as an aspiration to maintain their Japanese spirit and righteous mind, even while living abroad. Another interesting item is women's literary magazine Seito, which was influenced by Western feminism. Japanese American women living in Hawaii were confined to ethnic community, where everything was governed by Japanese language and then custom. So therefore, those imported publications from Japan might have helped those first generation of Japanese women in Honolulu learn new customs and facilitated their transition to American society. So the advertisement also listed the 2 books written by local writers and published by the Motoshige bookstore itself. Beyond selling books and magazines, Japanese bookstores in Hawaii offered additional services. For example, Motoshige Morishige bookstore delivered books and magazines to homes and offer reading advisory service and bibliographies of books, just like ones an American public libraries compile for patrons. Like public libraries today, these bookstores also provided such entertainment opportunities as sponsoring movies and acrobatic theater. So they celebrated both American and Japanese holidays within the ethnic community. In 1920, nine large bookstores in Hawaii formed Hawaii Book Business Guild. This was their response to the call by the Federation of All Japan Book Business Guilds, established in 1920. At the end of the Meiji era, the massive production of magazines intensified competition among the distributors and led to price dumping. So the Federation tried to control prices by organizing a hierarchical distribution system. And they also encouraged local book businesses to form their own regional guild. So Hawaii Book Business Guild responded to their call. So they applied to join the federation. However, it was rejected. The reason was Hawaii was outside of the federation's jurisdiction. Besides that, I found much evidence that at least before World War II, Japanese publishers and distributors perceived Hawaii as outside of their purview. So this Hawaii's Book Business Guild's rejection to become a federation member was quite different from bookstores in Japan's colonial locations such as Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan. So Japanese bookstores in those places also formed their own guilds and applied to be a member of that federation, which was accepted. And that was happened in 1920 and then 1922. Although those locations were called gaichi, or outside Japan, Japanese saw them as a part of their nation's future economic and political power. So their business rights must have protected by the federation, but also they are within the purview of Nippai, or Japanese Publishing Distribution Corporation. So this Nippai was charged by the government to consolidate the old publishers' distribution systems, and also censor all books and magazines they distributed. So my point here is that Hawaii understandably fell outside of the federation's business protection, but at the same time, Nippai's control It meant that Hawaii booksellers had a free hand to work directly with the Japanese publishers, and then also to escape censorship control. This well illustrated the socio-political environment and the mindset of the leaders of the Japanese publishing business at the time. Although I should conclude here. So this study is an ongoing examination of the Japanese book distribution system in Hawaii. Bookstore in Hawaii began as individual immigrants' entrepreneurial adventures, but their prosperity can be viewed as a grassroots defiance of a minority community, which was neglected by public institutions such as public libraries. Their business delivered more than Japanese publications to hard-toiling immigrant workers, but they provided textbooks to teach cultural heritage language to the second generation of Japanese American children, helped them form their own diasporic print culture, and also filled immigrants' information and entertainment needs. So by the end of the 1910s, the complete cycle of print culture, from publishers to distributors and bookstores, and further to individual readers, emerged within Honolulu Japanese American community. So these undocumented history of bookstores and reading circles in the ethnic community is a subject certainly deserve further research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noriko. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. Just a reminder for those who have joined, since we began, we're going to be taking questions at the end, and we're going to have questions that are given from the floor will be given from this microphone, so that we can all make sure that those joining us online will be able to hear the questions as well as the answers. So we will now move straight on to the next paper, which is going to be given by Matthew Chambers from the University of Warsaw. And Matthew's title is Brentano's Would Pay Hemingway, Selling Anglo-American Modernism in Paris. So Matthew, if you have a presentation, can I invite you to share screen?
Yeah, if you can make me the co-host as well.
Okay, you don't yet have that facility. Right. There, I'm getting a dab hand at this now. What I'm doing. Okay, has that worked?
It seems to, as long as everyone can see.
Brilliant.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so this is in case you don't know who this is a photo of Sylvia Beach sitting in Shakespeare and Company. I believe it's the first address, but I can check if you want to know. I had originally set out to explore the interconnections and possible sales profiles of the several English language bookshops in interwar Paris. When Sylvia Beach opened Shakespeare and Company in November 1919, there were 3 significant English language booksellers in the city: Galignani Library, Brentano's, and W.H. Smith. And another opened a few years after, curiously called At the Sign of the Black Mannequin. There is a story which prompted this idea, and this is the title, kind of feeds into the title of this presentation. Ernest Hemingway had walked into Shakespeare and Company, and by then he was a longtime customer in the late 30s. He was a longtime customer and friend of Beach's, but she wasn't in the shop, and when he tried to walk out with several copies of his new short story collection, The Fifth Column, the clerk tried to charge him for the copies, which he got understandably got pissed off about. But Beach, upon hearing the news, berated the clerk. Brentano's would pay Hemingway if he came to their shop. The message was clear. Shakespeare and Company was nothing without the company, and its more famous members drew business. And as a coda to this story, and I will move on from it, here's the record of Beach restocking those 5 copies by buying them from Brentano's. So as this story shows, the shops did not operate in isolation from one another. In the habit of treating Shakespeare and Company as a cultural island unto itself, sells Beach Short as a bookseller and Shakespeare and Company as a vibrant bookshop space in a city full of books. But instead of framing Shakespeare and Company comparatively with its local competition, I would instead like to focus on the shop's stock and what that tells us about international trade, publishing trends, and even profitability. All elements central to Shakespeare and Company's ability to stay in business under Beach's management for over 20 years. In all the photos of Sylvia Beach standing either in front of or inside Shakespeare and Company, we glimpse her books, but rarely can we make out the titles. Too often, this is also the case with writing on Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company. The actual books are the background to the preferred focus. But Shakespeare and Company was nothing without its stock. No better detail illustrates this point than while Shakespeare and Company effectively closed its doors in 1941, Sylvia Beach continued to operate the lending library from her apartment. That we tend not to consider the books in the bookshop and lending library often comes down to the strong habit of looking at Beach through the framework of others, especially James Joyce. Rather than approach Beach yet again through her well-documented role enabling Joyce's success, which pulls focus from her other skills as a bookseller and the success of Shakespeare and Company in a crowded bookselling market, I focus here on Shakespeare and Company's stock to advocate for Beach's agency as a bookseller and to detail how the shop operated as part of the international book trade in the interwar period. With the Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company archive, we not only have a rich amount of data on her lending library and its subscribers, but we also have an extensive record of her book acquisitions. Most of this information is held at Princeton University, and much of it has been made available at the Shakespeare and Company Project website, which is well worth the time visiting. It's a veritable rabbit hole for people like us. The data is somewhat rare for a bookshop of the early 20th century, and indeed overwhelming for the scholar. I will be focusing on a 2-year period of her book orders, 1928 to 1929, for a few reasons. One, by 1928, Shakespeare and Company had been open for nearly a decade, and Beach had by then established her major publisher contacts. Two, with the popularity brought by publishing Ulysses, the period represents a particularly active time for the shop. And three, it is the period just before the effects of a global economic depression are felt in Paris, and in particular at the bookshop. 2 years as a time frame also helps us see some patterns with titles Beach restocked and how often, which publishers she favored and what categories she stocked besides fiction and poetry. I guess what I'm saying is, as opposed to covering the full 20 years, which would take me a lot longer, I'm just taking a little snippet of data from a 2-year stretch. So such an approach reveals some expected patterns. Joyce was a clear bestseller, but also some unexpected results. By focusing on her stock, I hope to add a more complete picture of the role Shakespeare and Company played in how literary modernists were circulated and consumed. Shakespeare and Company's stock was a blend of old and new, journal and book, Joyce and everyone else. When Beach opened the shop, she had primarily stocked it with used titles bought in Paris. And from what she shares in her memoir, with acquisitions from Harold Munro's Poetry Bookshop and Elkin Matthews in London. And you're gonna have to forgive my French pronunciation through all of this, it's terrible, but from Boiveau and Chevalet, a kind of wholesaler who advertised broadly for all types of publications, Beach purchased 565 books as her initial stock. She also went to London and purchased 398 titles at Elkin Matthews. When Shakespeare and Company opened in 1919, it would have over 1,000 titles already in stock. What is striking about the acquisitions from Boiveau and Chevalet is how consistently canonical most of the works she purchased remain. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Butler, the Brontes, Edgar Allan Poe, Henry James, Oscar Wilde, and so on. Elkin Matthews sold their own publications, including several works by Ezra Pound, Lawrence Binyon's London Visions, 1908, and Nelson's Last Diary, 1917, among other curious titles like The Curse of the Ragged Stone, 1888, Sylvia's Rose and the May Moon, 1908, and Rainbows and Witches, 1913. From these initial orders, Beach grew her stock and publisher contacts over the following years. Beach famously turned this stock into a lending library, which dominated the form of business she conducted. She was eager to present the bookshop as a lending library from the start, and the Shakespeare and Company project has documented the extensiveness of the library's holdings, large number of patrons, and frequency of its use. It is fair to call the lending library the dominant aspect of the shop, but it was by no means its only function. Among the extensive records Beach managed to save and Princeton to acquire an archive are publisher orders for most of the years the bookshop was in business. In publisher orders for single copies of books for the lending library, sorry, let me start that over. In addition to publisher orders for single copies of books for the lending library, Beach often also ordered multiple copies to stock for sale. Repeat orders for multiple copies of the same title over several months also indicated emphasis on sales in addition to lending. For example, Rosamund Lehman's Dusty Answer, first published by Chatto and Windus in 1927. One copy arrives on the 8th of February, 1928, and is first lent out on the 30th of June, 1928. It's borrowed 5 separate times in 1928 and 1929 without any overlap, suggesting there's only one copy in the lending library. Meanwhile, between the 3rd of July, 1929 to the end of the year, Beach receives an additional 8 copies and orders of 1 or 2, presumably for sale. The store stock as a whole then was a careful balance between what was lent and what was sold. Turning to the 1928-1929 book orders, Beach recorded incoming titles organized by date of acquisition and provided the name of the publisher, the title, net price in pounds or dollars, the number of copies ordered, and occasionally a note if the title was damaged or returned. They show that after a decade, Beach had established contacts with at least 131 publishers. During those 2 years, she ordered 5,052 books, or 7 new volumes a day on average, not including the various periodicals she stocked or Ulysses or anything acquired locally from wholesalers or in trade from customers. Of those 131 publishers, she primarily ordered from 18 of them. So 3,865 books, or 76.5% of the total. And most of the orders were placed with publishers in the United Kingdom, so 4,403 books, or 87.2% of the total. Even if the process for getting the books through customs was time-consuming, shipping between London and Paris in the 1920s was regular, affordable, and fast. And this is from a kind of a large brochure that was handed out to people who stayed at the Hotel Terminus, and it had all sorts of information about where to shop, local doctors, and so on for English speakers, mostly Americans. It seemed to be targeted for. But here in this one section, they have information about the Postal Service. So there was same-day air service delivery advertised for letters and next-day service for parcels, with the latter priced similarly to surface shipping. And there is some evidence from the orders and from the returns that she could get a book replaced within a week. Some patterns emerged from these different publishers. So for example, 242 of the 422 favor orders during this time were books by T.S. Eliot. Large orders for single authors hold true at other publishers, indicated on this slide, and this just is an example of a few of them. While orders for Joyce's other publications are hardly surprising, it is worth noting his modern library order alone represents almost 19% of Beach's overseas orders. Indeed, while Beach certainly stocked plenty of American authors, she seems to have only ordered their books from US suppliers when necessary. For example, most of her Heinemann orders were from the UK offices, except for 27 copies of Ernest Hemingway titles. And Joyce, Hemingway, and E.E. Cummings alone account for almost 40% of the 649 US ordered titles, with publishers like Charles Scribner's Sons essentially being used to supply more Hemingway. So out of the 66 books ordered from Charles Scribner's, there was 57 of them were Hemingway titles. On the other hand, her largest orders with publishers such as Ernest Benn Limited, Oxford University Press, and James Dent and Sons are far more varied. With Benn and Dent, Beach predominantly ordered series titles like Sixpenny Library, Augustan Poets, and Augustan Books of Modern Poetry from Ernest Benn, and the Everyman Library from J.M. Dent. At Oxford, Beach placed large orders for World's Classics titles, 129 out of the 350 books. A series originated and bought from Grant Richards by Oxford in 1905. Richards was one of the first publishers Beach had established an account with, but perhaps more relevant was the series featured authors such as Eliot and Woolf writing introductions to specific titles. Oxford also appears to have been the most diligent of all the publishers in sending catalogs, reminders, and offers. Nearly 2/3 of the Routledge orders were for either titles in the Today and Tomorrow series or the Muses Library, so 47 and 48 out of the total 150 respectively. Most of this information confirms what we know about Sylvia Beach's interests and Shakespeare and Company's focus, but it only tells part of the story. In addition to the many modernist names we'd recognized, Beach was not averse to regularly ordering genre fiction, mainly crime fiction, but some romance and SF, reference materials like translation dictionaries, nonfiction like travel guides, and scientific works, both classical and modern, and even a fair amount of children's literature, a detail too often overlooked in the history of the shop. Perhaps the most curious detail from this data pertains to the second most ordered title during those 2 years, and the most ordered work of nonfiction. So the most ordered book during this time was A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Surprisingly, this number 2 is not written by one of the stable of authors we tend to associate with Shakespeare and Company. On the 4th of June, 1928, a single copy of Parenthood, Design or Accident, a manual of birth control. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I have a physical copy of this that I want to show you. If you can see, I can show this during the Q&A as well. It's a very curious book, so it's worth showing. Sorry, I interrupted the flow. But I'm going to talk about this book for a moment because it sticks out in the order history. So she initially orders a single copy of the book. 6 weeks later, she orders another 36 copies, which was by far the single greatest order of any individual title during this time period. By early April 1929, she had ordered almost 100 copies of the book from the Labor Publishing Company, a publisher she had no other business with. Authored by Michael Fielding, a pseudonym for Dr. Maurice Newfield, who was once H.G. Wells's personal physician and editor of both the British Medical Journal and the Eugenics Society's journal Eugenics Review. The book advocates for birth control for reasons of personal health and the public good. The former mainly presented in the book's longest chapter on types of birth control and how to use them, and the latter in more tortured prose attempting to differentiate Michael Fielding's claims on population control from the quote, easy fallacy of judging the biological qualities of a person by the depth of his purse, or of assuming, the term better, now applied to classes means anything other than richer. Like I said, tortured prose. It is outside the scope of this paper to unpack interwar medical discourse, and indeed there is precious little out there on Parenthood, the book. But suffice it to say, large orders for this title and for the Today and Tomorrow series clearly demonstrates that Beach's customers were conversant with trends beyond the literary. Indeed, the Today and Tomorrow series was a particularly interesting series motivated by a specific approach to popularizing current scientific knowledge and speculation. With authors like Vera Brittain writing on the future history of women's reproductive rights, and Robert Graves likewise writing on swearing, alongside consideration of the future history of genetics, chemical warfare, and androids, the series would have offered a provocative complement to the modernist literature which dominated the stock in the store. There are a few conclusions to draw from all this data, some obvious and are confirming the popular narratives about both Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company, and a few aspects which are too easily glossed over or ignored by those narratives. First, beginning with the most obvious, yes, James Joyce's Ulysses was popular, but so were any of his publications ordered during this time. So books by and about Joyce, not including Ulysses, represent the second greatest number of books ordered for any author. So Dubliners and A Portrait and all the other ones, the 274 copies, and an additional 28 copies of a book by Herbert Gorman on Joyce. I don't have the total numbers of Ulysses, but just to give it an example of how sales of Ulysses completely dwarfed all the numbers I'm talking about here. One example, Beach notes that she sold 105 copies of Ulysses in a 3-week span in May 1929. Beach also kept many other modernists well stocked, as this slide shows. Second, there are many single title orders, presumably for the lending library, but there is strong evidence she sold plenty of titles as well. 1,600 single title orders out of 5,052, but many of those were restock, and a multi-copy order could be both for sale and for the lending library. sorry, I lost my track. But even with those possibilities noted, more than 2/3 of her orders were clearly for sale. Third, Beach also ordered plenty of nonfiction and children's literature. It would be complicated to begin building categories for the titles found in this data, but there are numerous works which are not plays, novels, or poetry. Indeed, Beach sold and lent across a wide spectrum of readerly interests. Fourth, this essay has emphasized larger presses, and while only 18 publishers represented over 76% of her orders, Beach ordered a not insignificant 1,187 copies from the other 95 publishers during this period. And fifth, she avoided ordering from the US where possible. And with this data point, it is where common sense and popular myth conflict. Logistically speaking, it is reasonable she would have ordered from the UK when she could, but as Americans flooded Paris, and the American bookseller hosted American writers, and her one published novel was subject to famous legal actions in the US, there is a habit in thinking of Shakespeare and Company as a dealer in American books. However, in many cases where US publishers either had UK branches or headquarters for their business, or had partnerships or publishing deals on specific titles or series, Beach would place her orders in London. For the purposes of clarity, I've focused strictly on orders here. There's a complex story to tell about circulation as it consists of both sales and lending records. Profitability is another complicated aspect to unpack. Beach noted the net cost of the titles she ordered in either American dollars or British pounds, but her sales records are recorded in French francs. The post-World War I exchange rate between francs, pounds, and dollars could vary greatly depending on when one is looking. Demand, however, is easier to track with the order records. I've also refrained from tracking periodicals, partially as the record keeping is less consistent, but I also feel the subject is rich enough to deserve its own focus. However, what comes through with the records reviewed here most clearly are the contours of what we now consider a canonical Anglo-American literary modernism in demand at her shop. So Beach had a skill in hiding the mechanics of her business from public view quite artfully, to the extent that Shakespeare and Company is primarily still remembered for its more sociable aspects. That it provided much sought-after English language literature of the day to the growing number of expatriates in Paris, and thus contributed to the formation of the transnational networks of literary modernism, has been known, if underanalyzed. By approaching her stock and from whom she ordered, we can not only better understand the stock and trade of Shakespeare and Company, we can also begin to understand how similarly focused and networked modernist bookshops and other metropolitan centers, where we have less surviving archival data, may have ordered and operated. Stock, in short, is where the story begins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So now we move on to Paul Tankard. Find your name. Paul, you have your hand raised. Is there a reason for that? Oh, you're clapping. I'm sorry.
I was clapping.
You were clapping. I see that the hand has more than one function in life.
Yes, I'll see if I can get rid of that. No. Gone. I hope. No.
Right. Okay. So we're going to just pass on to you now the title of your paper, A Musty Literary Extravaganza, Dunedin's Regent Theatre 24-hour book sale. And I believe I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, I'll see how that goes. Here we are. And play from start, is that right? Excellent. Now, can you all see my slides there?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Greetings to you all from the Southern Hemisphere, where it's 9 o'clock in the evening and not raining. And it's a great pleasure to be with you. My paper is, as we've just been told, called A Musty Literary Extravaganza. When those of us who love books and their contents come to study the circulation and distribution of our favourite cultural artefacts, and it's already been observed that a good many of us are showing in the background of our slides evidence of our collecting proclivities, we're almost by default driven to look at the commercial and institutionalized aspects of the market. And that's been pretty much the case with a lot of the presentations over this last few days. We think of publishers, shops, and professional booksellers. Almost inevitably, we overlook dispersed and intermittent phenomena such as large and local community book sales. In this paper, I want to look at, from a variety of angles, one such event, the Regent Theatre 24-hour book sale, which has been held annually in Dunedin, New Zealand, every year since 1981, with a couple of recent exceptions, and has raised in at least 4 of those years in excess of $100,000 by selling second-hand books, mostly for $1 each. It's not the money that's raised that interests me, though that is clearly an indicator of many things, and it's information to which we actually have access. But what I think book historians need to consider is that by such events as these, a great many books are dispersed, reading is facilitated, and thousands of people are enabled to engage in reading for private and otherwise unmonitored purposes of study and pleasure. Dunedin's Regent Theatre book sale has been, until the last few years, held over 24 hours from midday Friday to midday Saturday in the middle of winter in the grand old Central City Theatre, to the preservation, maintenance and operations of which the funds raised by the book sale are a major consideration. Here's the Regent Theatre. This is clearly a publicity photo because we don't have vintage vehicles like that driving around Dunedin on a daily basis. And here is the interior of the theatre set up to perform its normal function, which is being a theatre. Dunedin is a peculiarly literary city, as evidenced by its designation in 2014 as the 7th of the now 42 UNESCO Cities of Literature. Yet the book sale is without any institutional or even much personal connection to other more formal aspects of the city's book culture, represented by such institutions as the Readers and Writers Festival, the Writers' Walk, the university, its English department and its Centre for the Book, the Robert Burns Writers Fellowship, the Children's Writer in Residency, the Robert Lord Writers Cottage, the 3 major libraries, the poems on the back of the parking tickets, the Lilliput libraries in people's front gardens, and the locally based or represented booksellers and publishers. Each of these has a budget, a staff or a board, a mission statement, stakeholders, spokespeople, a website. By contrast, the book sale remains a truly ground-up rather than top-down, unsubsidised, egalitarian, community-based literary experience. It is run by volunteers, it sells only donated materials, and is governed to a great extent by oral tradition, all of which lends it, from an academic point of view, a kind of invisibility. There seems to be no scholarly discourse at all around such events. The first sale of the uninterrupted tradition was held in July 1981. The convener was a former chairman of the Otago Theatre Trust and local dentist, Doug Lovell. The sale was kick-started, as Mr. Lovell relates, when the trust was donated a huge amount, elsewhere reported as 2 truckloads, of sheet music. And we knew a sheet music sale wouldn't be a goer. So we decided to have a books and music sale. It was designated the 24-hour book, music and picture sale and held as part of the Help Heat the Regent campaign. Book collection started 7 weeks before the sale. The council and local businesses supported the event by closing the streets in the vicinity of the theatre, although shops in the area remained open and various displays were held outside. Inside the theatre, there was live musical entertainment for the whole 24 hours of the sale, a tradition which has continued. The 1981 event raised over $10,000. The following year, it was again a music, book and art sale and raised the same amount, much to the trust's satisfaction. Doug Lovell obviously found his calling as a book sale convener. He retired in 2010 after 30 years in the role. After the first year, Lovell decided he needed the help of someone with more experience in the book world and invited local history teacher and bookman Paul Oban to select and price the more special items. All other items, by far the greater proportion, were, until 2008, priced at 50 cents. In 1983, national TV coverage was credited with doubling the numbers of attending, and the sale grossed in excess of $11,000. For the next 14 years, it set a new sales record every year, reaching over $68,000 in 1993. In 3 years in the mid-1990s, takings took a dip into the 50Ks, although this was attributable, at least in part, to the sale coinciding in 1994 with a rugby test match between New Zealand and South Africa, and in 1995 with it being the university mid-year vacation. But takings soon started creeping back up again, and despite a couple of hiccups, in 2010 reached a record figure of $118,000. The second convener of the Regent Theatre 24-hour book sale is British-born Alison Cunningham, who has a professional background in project management. Describing herself as an absolute bookworm all my life, she started as a Sunday sorter in 2005 and assisted Doug Lovell in his final sale in 2010. She was convener of the sale for 12 years until stepping down just a few weeks ago and being replaced apparently by a committee of 8 people. The business of the book sale now extends over almost the full year. In 2014, Alison Cunningham told the local newspaper, the Otago Daily Times, "We only have 2 months off. After the sale, we clean up and take June and July off, then we're back into it." In 2009, there was a team of 200 volunteers who collected, sorted and priced books during the 8-month lead up to the sale. While most of these 200 helpers come and go, week by week there is a core team of 40 to 50 who meet on Sunday mornings to sort out the books. Numbers involved inevitably vary from year to year. The books used to be stored and sorted in the rooms under the stage of the theatre, but after this warren of rooms was converted into a single rehearsal room in the major renovation of 2011, the sorters began meeting in the Regent Theatre's hired storage depot, and the bulk of the work is done before the 24 frantic hours of the event itself. And there is an image of the event itself, one of many that you'll find floating around on the internet, which I think give a bit of an impression of just the kind of exciting and attractive event that it is in the middle of a cold winter's night. One could go into the details of the sale at much greater length. There is data about the deployment of personnel, sorters, cashiers, catering, security, the heavy lifters, how the annual proceeds are used, the sorting and pricing of the books, the subject categories, the arrangement of the sales space, publicity, the sponsors, the fate of the leftovers, and the recent spin-off Anything But book sale, which sells other media, LPs, CDs, DVDs, sheet music, board games, posters, and jigsaw puzzles. Over and above these empirical topics, there are the intangibles, the atmosphere and experience of people attending the sale, some reflection of which may be found in the descriptive and anecdotal coverage of the events provided by the Otago Daily Times. That the sale is held in the centre of the city and in the theatre itself, rather than, say, in a warehouse, contributes greatly to the event as a social and aesthetic experience. Being held over 24 hours is practical in that it minimises the time that the theatre is unavailable for performances, but it also makes nocturnal visits something of an adventure, particularly on a long, cold winter night. Another important aspect of the sale itself is that nothing like all the book stock can be displayed at once, so the tables are topped up throughout the 24 hours, meaning that dedicated buyers need to make a number of visits, and this contributes greatly to the levels of anticipation and excitement. Clearly, the Regent Theatre 24-hour book sale has a place in the history of Dunedin, has a place in any study of community fundraising or in the history of major events. But the main thing about it, I want to argue, is that it's not a raffle, not a sausage sizzle, not a pub quiz, but a book sale. and the account of its history and circumstances, such as I've given here and into which I go into far more detail if time allowed, can seem a little bit like reporting a rugby game and not saying anything about the match. But the trouble is, no one knows how many books are displayed or sold, or how many patrons make how many purchases on how many visits. In 1989, Doug Lovell told the reporter that 78,000 items were sold. However, the following year, the ODT reported that 100,000 were left over after the sale. One gets the impression that such figures are made up purely in response to reporters' questions. In 1993, someone estimated that there had been 750,000 books in the sale, of which 75% had been sold. In 2001, it was announced there would be 300,000 books, of which 95% would be for sale for 50 cents. And without conducting an annual survey using scientifically randomized samples, there is no knowing what constitutes the book stock by, for example, age or genre. How I wish I had the graphs that Matthew was able to show us in the last presentation. The history of the book sale is inevitably anecdotal in the original sense of the word anecdote, a secret history. It is a considerable part of the appeal of such an event that it is an unmonitored section of the economy and thus entirely composed of surprises. And it's not as if it's the only event of its kind. An inquiry to the Sharp list quickly yielded information about the following, which I list here by location, followed by their title or host institution and the date of which it began. You'll see that there are similar events in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, as well as New Zealand, and no doubt many others that my brief survey didn't track down. But about the Regent Theatre book sale, I can, of course, contribute my own anecdotes. I have not missed a Regent book sale in the 20 years I've been in Dunedin, and I've kept an intermittently careful record of my purchases. But of course, any one person's purchases will, unless they are a book dealer, represent their own particular interests. I've bought literally hundreds of books at the book sale, but my highlights have included, and I'll just wave some of them in front of you now. I've got a bit of a list here, and I've selected these highlights. Some of them, the reasons will be obvious, some of them less so. I won't comment on them all, but you see in 2005, I got 2 volumes of the Twickenham edition of the Poems of Pope. I've now got all 7 volumes of them without leaving the city or spending much money at all. 2006, I got Dorothy Sayers' introductory papers on Dante, which was particularly exciting because 2 years before I'd bought its sequel, Further Papers on Dante. So I got both of those, probably from the library of the same individual, 2 years apart at the book sale. I've got, what else here? The Faber and Faber volume Revelation with its dust wrapper containing a rare essay by T.S. Eliot and other people. I've got G.K. Chester, the first edition of G.K. Chesterton's 4 Faultless Felons, but without its dust wrapper, sadly. I was very excited to get the last volume I needed of the series of essays of yesterday and today, published in the 1920s by Harrop. Not the sort of thing that you find in book catalogues, and usually if you find them only $1 or so each. And I've got all 27 now. And then in 2016, you'll see Charles Williams' Image of the City there. The main interest of that was, for me, finding the book plate of Dan Davin, New Zealand short story writer and probably a colleague of Williams's at Oxford University Press, where he worked for 25 years in the mid-20th century. And then I've expanded my collection of miniature editions of Boswell's Life of Johnson, which I'm in the midst of writing an essay at present about abridged editions of Boswell's Life of Johnson. So this has really been a stimulus to my scholarship. Now, some of these purchases represent my established interests: Johnson, the Inklings, the English essay. Others are just opportunistic. Clearly, attending a sale like this where everything is cheap and there is an immense and uncurated variety, is one of the ways in which tastes develop and are expanded, and for better or worse, book collecting begins. For $1, one can afford to take a risk. But there are other things to be learned from attending a sale like this too. For someone interested as I am, and as indeed I think all scholars of the humanities need to be at this particular point of history, there is the interest in the history of reading. There's lots of things to be learned from surveying such a range of book stock. Things that I've noted down for myself, including the amazing proliferation of classic books in series that were published during the 20th century from commercial publishers, so that at any given time, most classic books, there was 5 or 6 editions of it to choose from in print, editions of all kinds and sizes, paperback, hardback, large print, small print, fancy and cheap. This also kept in print many obscure classics, which I suspect will never be printed again. Things that I've got include Roger Ascham's The Schoolmaster, The Letters of Dorothy Osborne, William Cobbett's Easy Grammar, John Wilson's Noctes Ambrosianae. I can't see any of those books ever being included in a series by a modern or postmodern publisher. At the other end of the cultural spectrum, one sees bestsellers from the past, things which have disappeared possibly for good reason from cultural memory. The verse novel The White Cliffs by American writer Alice Duer Miller, which was extremely popular in England during the Second World War and equally popular here in New Zealand, apparently. I've seen dozens and dozens of copies of that. And equally in 2015, there were an awful lot of copies of 50 Shades of Grey. Also apparent is the popularity of anthologies, particularly of poetry, not as textbooks for students, but apparently for general reading. Plenty of well-written, informative, but non-academic non-fiction. I think of A.G. Street's books about farming, or Ivor Brown's books about words, or even C.S. Lewis's books on religion, read by an educated but unprejudiced general public. There were mass market editions of literary criticism, which is curious for those of us engaged in the business of literary criticism these days, published for general readers and not necessarily by university presses, books that these days wouldn't be affordable or probably even readable for people outside the academy. Also, the ways in which texts have been abridged for the common reader. And also evident from the sales offerings is the frequency with which books used to be reprinted and how long they would sometimes remain in print. Just as other collectors would buy other books than I would, other book historians would, of course, gain other insights from the experience. My point is that whatever you think of these particular themes, the sale is a learning experience. Samuel Johnson, who clearly never attended the Regent Book Sale, said in a letter to Boswell, explaining to him a selection of rather tatty books that he'd sent him in Edinburgh, conceded that there were among them some which you will never need read through, but there are none which it is not proper for you to know or sometimes to consult. Of these books, of which the use is only occasional, it is often sufficient to know the contents, that when any question arises, you may know where to look for information. This is the sort of thing one can learn from collecting and visiting such a sale as I've described. Some years ago, I was at a meeting of 30 or so people with strong interests in Dunedin's literary life and in the promotion of reading and literature. In a discussion of what we thought were the city's most important literary phenomena, there was a roll call of all the various institutions and bodies and activities that I mentioned earlier. I said that, to my mind, the most important literary activities were, firstly, people in libraries, on buses, in parks, cafes, in their own home, privately reading for pleasure. And secondly, the Regent Book Sale. I was a bit surprised when some of the group asked me afterwards, is the Regent Book Sale really worth going to? Or told me, I've been here 10 years and I've never been, or I used to go, or asked me, isn't it mostly rubbish? Well, most things, I suppose, are mostly rubbish, really. But what can this be called other than snobbery? Clearly, for some people, Their books and their reading, like their clothes and their cars, must be completely up to date. Described by an anonymous journalist in 1985 as a musty extravaganza, the Regent book sale has embedded itself into the culture of its host city. At the time of the 10th sale, Doug Lovell observed, above all else, it can only work in Dunedin, within the Dunedin environment. Dunedin has the highest rate of new book sales per capita of any city in New Zealand, and as long as there are new books in Dunedin, there will be second-hand books. In 1982, the chairman of the Otago Theatre Trust, Mr. G. Clarkson, clearly surprised by the sales success 2 years in a row, noted that an event like this can be in danger of petering out sometimes. There are, I think, 40 years later, no signs of petering out. The Regent Theatre book sale manifests signs of a great many other social, literary and intellectual processes, but the petering out of the sales of books is not one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I see that there is actually a coffee break scheduled between this panel and the next panel, but I think we have 10 minutes or so for questions to any of the panelists. I think those of you online, could you perhaps use the raised hand function? That would be the surefire way of your question being heard. Those in the room, can you please wave your hand and then come up to the little stage we have here and put your question from where I'm sitting. Yes, Kristen.
Hello. Thank you all for stimulating an energetic panel. Really enjoyed it. So my question is for Noriko, and actually it's sort of two questions, if that's all right with you. The first one is about the sources that you use to track Japanese booksellers, right? Your point is that they're often invisible in records having to do with Hawaii's status in the US, as well as just sort of a dearth of interest. And so where are you finding, you know, what archives, what sort of historical records are you using to track Japanese booksellers in Hawaii? And the second question, sort of related or not, is a question about, to what degree have you found or have you looked into the pasts, the Japanese past of your immigrant Hawaiian booksellers? Are these booksellers continuing professional networks and work that they did in Japan? Or is Hawaii an entrepreneurial space for getting into bookselling for the first time? Thanks.
Thank you so much for asking questions. My source was for research is that look into basically the Japanese bookstores advertisement and appeared in the local vernacular newspapers. So those are digitized. So I can do the keyword search. So that was the main thing. But I have other sources like local, you know, annual kind of history books, and then also people's kind of memoirs and diaries. So the various other materials I triangulate, things. But reading is the kind of, bookstore history, first of all, those are immigrants. So they are kind of sometimes kind of transition, as I explained that they deal with different things. So this year they were, registered as the bookstore, but next year they are registered as a, like a general, a store or something like that. So they could be a transitional, business. So business records are almost none. So that was a really challenging part of my research. And the second question is that was a really interesting question to me too. Currently, based on my research, there's at least more than 40 bookstores existed before pre-war, pre-World War II. But at the beginning of the World War II, Japan was the enemy of the United States. So they closed, so that time that all those bookstores, forced to, themselves too, close their business. But after that war ended, some of them came back. But I think a lot of second generation is getting older, and it's third generations and fourth generations. There's not so much people who could read Japanese itself, although some Japanese from Japan migrated or for business in various reasons come to Hawaii. So they have some kind of needs for Japanese publications, but not like before pre-war time. So a lot of bookstores closed. And then right now, interestingly, there's no bookstores existed, Japanese bookstores in Hawaii.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Matthew, if I may. Are you able to track the relative percentage of cheap editions? I'm thinking of British literature in particular, or literature from British publishers. The relative percentage of cheap edition compared to newly published works, because I noticed that obviously the Cape editions of Joyce were the cheaper editions. You had Chatto and Windus with a large number, and presumably those would have been the cheaper Phoenix Library editions. You mentioned the Modern Library.
I had this all in I took this from the notebook. The problem with the sales books, and actually a problem with a lot of her record keeping, is there is an organizational system, but it's not helpful always. So the order book, there's one from 1926 to 1933 that I took the data from, and it's arranged by, she has it broken into sections alphabetically. So you have section A, B, and so on. And then within A, it's the order date. So it's by order, like when it arrives into the shop. I moved that over into a spreadsheet. The one thing I didn't record, and probably should have, and need to go back and do, are the prices, because she also wasn't consistently recording them. So it's feasible. I just haven't done it, I think is maybe the short answer for that. And also, just the kind of transposing that data from the notebooks into a spreadsheet took a few weeks. So in just that 2-year stretch. So I started over a few times because I was coming across questions like that, like, oh, maybe I do need to keep track of questions like this. So that's just another one. So the short answer is no, I haven't, but yes, I should. And I probably will. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have another question in the room. Yep, we're going to a little musical chair.
Tim White, I'm a professional bookseller, and this is a question for Matthew. I'm very intrigued by what you do, because this is something that I have to do regularly, stock takes and orders and things like that. You've got visual stock takes with all of the photography, and I was wondering if they were datable and whether that would give you any insights into the way that the store actually functioned, such as the way that shelving occurs, or the way that she's positioned authors next to each other, or even editions. Certainly if you have sales records and purchase records, you'd be able to see what's moving and how it's moving and how she's presenting it to the public.
I mean, one of the things I would like to do is present a kind of visualization in that regard. I mean, and what inspired it is exactly that, those photographs. You can't read any of the information on the spines or on the covers. It's very frustrating. It's like tantalizingly close to being legible in a lot of them, even with the kind of high res ones that are available at the Princeton has made a lot. I should point out that a lot of the content I have is publicly freely available on the Princeton University Archives, like digital collections site, and also through the Shakespeare and Company project. But yeah, it is something that I am long-term working on. I haven't fully organized it yet, and I need to talk to a developer about it, but I am working on a database of several kind of contemporary booksellers where that information is available. And that would be one way I'd like to visualize the data, is to somehow present exactly as you described, to kind of present it visually in some way. Because that would be the question I would like to know, especially looking at these photos, is if you were to walk into Shakespeare and Company on date X, what could you reasonably see on the shelf? Like, you know, that kind of, and present, you know, that possibility. The other thing, and I know this is kind of tying into Andrew's question in the chat about the lending library, there is Modernism, Modernity, and the Journal of Cultural Analytics is, and this is what this paper is about, is co-publishing a group of papers based on all this data, hopefully coming out next year. I know it's in the works. There are other people who have written about and studied the lending library closer than I have. Like my little section was the stock. So there will be scholarship coming out within a year answering more of the questions that I'm attempting here, but specifically focused on Shakespeare and Company and Sylvia Beach. So I know someone, for example, I know someone wrote about the American Library of Paris. So I think that's going to be part of the collection. Someone was supposed to be doing something with sales and so on. So there are other kind of frameworks that this can be approached from that I just haven't done.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time, but I wonder if I could quickly ask one question to Paul. You were in your wonderful show and tell. You were speculating about where some of these books came from. Where do they come from, and what knowledge do we have about how the books actually find their way into this sale?
Thanks for that question. The books are all donated. I realised that was a bit of a gap in all the things that I could have said about it. The Regent Theatre, it's simply well known around the town that the Regent Book Sale is an event. The city is small enough for the knowledge to be pretty widespread. There's people take boxes from as soon as the sale's finished, people start taking boxes of books to the Regent Theatre and leaving them there in the foyer, and they're eventually shuffled off to the place where they're stored, the warehouse, the mill that the theatre owns. So they come from people's libraries, often deceased estates, so that if you know that some book collector has died in the past 12 months, you'll find his or her books scattered around the sale site. Sometimes you'll learn that people have died by finding their books there. So that's often, but people downsizing their libraries. The Regent is really the first place that people go to get rid of books now, because they don't ask any questions, and it's so much trouble trying to get book dealers to come and look at things. They'll only take a quarter of what you want to get rid of. So yes, it's all donations from local people. And part of the sort of prehistory of it is that, as I said, Dunedin has always been a book town, so there've always been lots of books in circulation. And you see sometimes the same books there year after year. When libraries are broken up, a number of theological libraries in particular have broken up in the last couple of decades, and those books have often gone to the book sale. So they come from the city, they come from and from nowhere else, and they go back into the city again. So there's a sense in which they're constantly circulating.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we probably should pause for a break now. Am I correct in saying that this Zoom meeting will be closed, and the next panel will have a separate Zoom meeting, and the little thing, which I've forgotten what they're called, the QR code is available in the handbook that has been provided for you. So can we please thank the three speakers again